The 4-year-old boy ripped the Luna crown from Vivian's perfectly styled hair and hurled it across the polished granite floor. The entire pack watched in horror as the platinum circlet, blessed by the moon goddess herself, skittered across stone and stopped at the feet of a trembling Omega servant girl covered in flower dust. Alpha Daemon froze mid-ceremony, his hand still outstretched toward his chosen Luna. The crown had never been rejected. Not in 400 years of pack history. Not once. But his son, little Caspian, wasn't finished. The child climbed down from his father's arms, walked through the stunned silence, picked up the crown with his tiny hands, and placed it directly on the Omega's head. 8 months earlier, everything had seemed perfect. Alpha Daemon Thorn believed he'd finally found the Luna his pack deserved. Daemon was not a young alpha. At 36, he had led the Ironwood pack through war, famine, and betrayal. His shoulders bore scars from battles that would have killed lesser wolves. His eyes carried the weight of decisions that had saved his pack, but cost him pieces of his soul. He was respected, feared, admired. But he was alone. His mate, his true mate, had died in childbirth 4 years ago, taking most of Daemon's heart with her. She'd lived just long enough to place their son in his arms, to whisper the name Caspian, and to make him promise he would love again. For 4 years, Daemon had honored her first wish. He loved their son with fierce devotion. But the second wish had remained unfulfilled. Then Vivian Ashford entered his life like a winter storm. Beautiful, confident, utterly certain of her place in the world. She was the daughter of the neighboring pack's alpha, educated in the finest academies, trained in politics and pack management since birth. She had the kind of beauty that seemed carved by the gods themselves. Sharp cheekbones, cascading blonde hair, eyes like ice. She looked exactly like what a Luna should be. Daemon's advisors loved her. His beta, Silas Kane, practically sang her praises at every council meeting. His warriors respected her tactical mind. Even the pack elders nodded their approval when Daemon announced his intention to make Vivian his chosen Luna. "She's perfect," Silas had said. "Strong bloodline, intelligent, beautiful. The pack will thrive under her leadership." Daemon had agreed. On paper, Vivian was everything his pack needed. So why did something in his chest constrict every time he looked at her? He dismissed it as grief. He told himself that respect could be enough. Partnership could be enough. He'd been wrong. But 8 months ago, there was only one person who seemed uncertain about the match. Caspian had never liked Vivian. From the first moment she'd entered their home, the boy had hidden behind his father's legs. When she'd tried to embrace him, he'd burst into tears. When she'd attempted to read him stories, he'd thrown the books across the room. Daemon had apologized profusely, explaining that his son was still adjusting. Vivian had smiled graciously and said she understood. That children were difficult. That Caspian would come around in time. She'd been patient for about 3 weeks. After that, Daemon began noticing small things. The way Vivian's smile never quite reached her eyes when Caspian was in the room. The way she'd suggest the boy spend more time with the pack nannies. The way she'd flinch when Caspian made too much noise during her planning sessions. "He needs structure," she'd said one evening. "You're too soft with him, Daemon. A future alpha must learn discipline early." Daemon had felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he'd nodded. Perhaps she was right. When he tried to implement Vivian's suggestions, stricter bedtimes, less playtime, more educational activities for a 4-year-old, Caspian had become withdrawn. The bright, curious child who'd laughed despite losing his mother had started having nightmares, started wetting the bed again, started flinching when Daemon raised his voice. It had taken Daemon exactly 4 days to abandon Vivian's parenting philosophy and return to his instincts. When Daemon had gently told Vivian they'd continue raising Caspian his way, she'd smiled that perfect smile and acquiesced. But he'd seen something flash in her eyes. Something sharp and cold that was gone before he could examine it properly. Meanwhile, there was someone else in Daemon's territory who was having her own struggles. though Damon knew nothing about her. Nora. The name meant nothing to the Alpha. Why would it? She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack hierarchy. Omegas didn't attend council meetings or warrior training. They served, they cleaned, they cooked. They remained invisible unless someone needed something. Nora had been invisible her entire life. She was 24 years old and had been orphaned at 9 when her parents, both Omegas, had died in the same border war that had scarred Damon's back. She'd grown up in the pack's communal housing, raised by a rotation of caretakers who taught her the essential skills of survival. Keep your head down, keep your voice quiet, keep your presence minimal. She'd learned those lessons well. Nora worked in the pack's central kitchen, starting her shifts before dawn and finishing long after the high-ranking wolves had finished their evening meals. Her hands were perpetually raw from washing dishes. Her back ached from carrying heavy pots. Her feet hurt from standing on stone floors for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. But she never complained. She had auburn hair that she kept tied back in a practical braid, and eyes the color of sage, though almost no one had looked at her long enough to notice. She was short, barely 5'2", with a slight build. She had a small scar on her right wrist from a burn she'd gotten at 17 when she'd stumbled carrying a pot of boiling soup. This was Nora's life. This was what she expected it would always be. She had no illusions about climbing the pack hierarchy or finding a mate. She'd seen what happened to Omegas who dreamed too big. They got their hearts broken and their spirits crushed. So Nora kept her head down, did her work, and tried to find small joys where she could. The way bread dough felt under her hands when she needed it. The satisfaction of seeing perfectly clean dishes stacked and ready. The rare moments of kindness from the head cook, an elderly woman named Marta, who sometimes snuck her extra portions when no one was looking. Then Alpha Damon announced his engagement to Vivian, and Nora's predictable world began to crack. The preparations for a Luna ceremony of this magnitude required months of planning. The pack house had to be deep cleaned until it gleamed. The gardens had to be manicured. The ceremonial grounds had to be prepared. The workload tripled, then quadrupled. The Omegas worked 20-hour days, snatching sleep in brief intervals, surviving on scraps and sheer determination. Worse than the physical exhaustion was the presence of Vivian herself. The future Luna had moved into the pack house 8 weeks before the ceremony. She swept through the halls like a conquering general, finding fault with everything. This floor isn't clean enough. Do it again. These flowers are wilting. Replace them immediately. The silver isn't polished to my standards. Try again. Nora heard these commands secondhand, passed down through the hierarchy of servants. She rarely saw Vivian directly. Omegas were meant to be invisible after all. But she felt the woman's presence like a weight pressing down on the entire staff. The other Omegas whispered, when they thought no one was listening, about how she'd berated a young servant until the girl collapsed in tears. About how she'd demanded the head gardener be fired because a single petal had fallen on her gown. About how she'd suggested to Alpha Damon that the pack should streamline its Omega population. Damon had apparently refused that suggestion, but the fact that Vivienne had made it at all sent chills through the Omega quarters. "She's going to make our lives hell," Marta muttered one night as she and Nora prepared bread. It was past midnight, and they were both swaying with exhaustion. "That woman has no heart." Nora had nodded silently, too tired to speak. But deep in her chest something stirred. Something that felt almost like anger. She'd seen Alpha Damon with his son. It had been an accident, really. She'd been carrying a basket of linens through one of the hallways when she'd heard laughter. Bright, uninhibited, joyful laughter. She'd frozen, recognizing it as the sound of a child. She'd peeked around a corner and had seen Alpha Damon on his hands and knees in one of the gardens, while little Caspian rode on his back like he was a horse. The mighty Alpha, who commanded, one of the strongest packs in the territory, was making neighing sounds and pretending to buck while his son shrieked with delight. Nora had stood there transfixed, watching as Damon had finally collapsed on the grass in mock exhaustion. Caspian had climbed off his back and thrown himself at his father's face, planting a kiss on his cheek. Damon had wrapped his arms around the boy and held him close, and the expression on the alpha's face had been so tender, so full of pure love, that Nora had felt tears prick her eyes. This was who Damon truly was, not the stern alpha in council chambers. A father who loved his son with every fiber of his being. Then Vivian's voice had cut through the moment like a blade. Damon, really? Rolling in the dirt like a common wolf. What will the servants think? Nora had pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible. Let them think what they will, Damon had said quietly. I'm spending time with my son. Time that would be better spent reviewing the ceremony protocols, Vivian had replied smoothly. Or did you forget we have the council from the Northern Territory arriving tomorrow? Caspian had hidden behind his father's leg, peeking out at Vivian with obvious fear. The woman hadn't even glanced at him. Damon had sighed, a sound so heavy with resignation that Nora had felt it in her own chest, and nodded. You're right. Caspian, let's get you cleaned up. I've already had the nanny prepare him for his meal in the nursery, Vivian had said. You and I need to discuss the seating arrangements. Nora had seen Damon's jaw tighten, had seen him look down at his son's disappointed face, had seen the moment he'd given in. Go with Nanny Iris, Caspian. Papa has work to do. The little boy's face had crumpled, but he'd nodded obediently. As he'd walked past Vivian toward the house, the woman had stepped aside as if avoiding contamination. She hadn't touched him, hadn't offered comfort, hadn't acknowledged him at all. And Nora, hiding in the hallway with her basket of linens, had felt that dangerous something stir in her chest again. That feeling that was too much like anger, too much like injustice. Something had shifted in her that day. Some small seed of resistance had been planted. She'd started paying attention. She found herself noticing things as she moved through the pack house on her endless errands. The way Vivian never smiled when she thought no one was watching. The way she spoke differently to high-ranking wolves than she did to servants. The way she'd rearrange her features into warmth whenever Damon appeared, only to let the mask slip the moment he looked away. Nora saw, because no one saw her. Omegas were furniture, wallpaper, invisible. Like the time she'd been cleaning the hallway outside Damon's office and had overheard Vivian speaking with her father through the door that had been left slightly ajar. The ceremony is in 2 weeks, Vivian had said, frustration tight in her voice. And that child still barely tolerates me. It doesn't matter, her father had replied, his voice deeper, rougher. Once you're Luna, you'll have the authority to send him to boarding school. The boy is too soft anyway. Damon has ruined him with all that coddling. Damon won't agree to boarding school. He's obsessed with the boy. Then you'll have to work on that slowly, carefully. Make Damon see that what he thinks is love is actually weakness. Once you have your own pups, heirs with proper breeding and training, he'll see the difference. The boy will fade into irrelevance. Nora's hands had frozen on her cleaning cloth. She'd felt sick. They were talking about Caspian like he was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. And the Omega situation? Vivian had asked. One battle at a time, daughter. Secure your position first. Once you're established as Luna, once you have Damon's trust, you can reshape this pack however you see fit. Nora had fled before she could hear more, her heart pounding. She'd hidden in a storage closet and tried to catch her breath, tried to process what she'd just heard. Vivienne was planning to send Caspian away, to have him replaced by her own children, to remake the pack into something harsh and cruel. And there was nothing Nora could do about it. She was an Omega. Who would believe her if she tried to tell someone? She'd be dismissed as a jealous servant spreading rumors. She'd be punished, expelled, maybe worse. So she'd done what Omegas did. She'd kept silent. She'd gone back to work. She'd tried to forget. but she couldn't forget the look on little Caspian's face when Vivian had stepped aside to avoid him. Couldn't forget the sound of his laughter when his father had played with him. Couldn't forget that a child was in danger and everyone was too blind to see it. Then, 4 days before the ceremony, something happened that changed everything. Nora had been carrying a tray of pastries to the Alpha's private dining room when she'd heard crying, soft, muffled sobs coming from behind a partially closed door. She should have kept walking. It wasn't her business. But the crying sounded so heartbroken that her feet had carried her to the door before she'd consciously decided to move. Through the crack, she'd seen Caspian sitting on the floor of what must have been his bedroom, surrounded by toys he wasn't playing with. Tears streamed down his chubby cheeks, and he was clutching a stuffed wolf that looked well-loved and worn. "Want Mama," he'd sobbed to the toy. "Want Mama back. Don't want new Mama. She's mean. She doesn't love me." Nora's heart had shattered. She'd set down the tray carefully, quietly, and had knelt by the door. "Hello," she'd said softly. Caspian had jerked his head up, his amber eyes wide with surprise and fear. "I'm not supposed to talk to servants," new Mama said. "That's a good rule," Nora had replied, though the words had tasted like ash. "But I heard you crying, and I couldn't just walk away. Are you okay?" "No," he'd said with the brutal honesty of a toddler. "I'm sad. Papa is going to have a new Mama, and she doesn't like me. She wants me to go away." "I'm sure that's not true," Nora had lied. "It is true," Caspian had insisted. "She looks at me like I'm yucky, like I'm bad. Papa doesn't see it, but I see it." The matter-of-fact way he'd said it had made Nora's eyes burn with tears. She'd done something incredibly stupid then. Something that could have gotten her expelled from the pack, or worse. She'd pushed the door open fully and had walked into the room. She'd knelt down in front of Caspian and had looked him straight in the eyes. "Your papa loves you more than anything in the whole world," she'd said fiercely. "More than being Alpha, more than this pack, more than anything. And anyone who can't see how special you are is the one who's wrong, not you. Never you." Caspian had stared at her with those big amber eyes, and something in his expression had shifted. "You're nice. What's your name?" "Nora." "That's pretty?" He'd smiled then, a small, watery smile. "Do you work here?" "I do, in the kitchens. Do you make the cookies? The ones with chocolate?" "Sometimes." "Those are my favorite." He paused, then held out his stuffed wolf. "This is Storm. He was Mama's. Papa gave him to me after Mama went to the moon goddess. Storm is sad too." Nora had gently touched the worn toy. "Then maybe Storm and you can be sad together. And maybe when you're very sad, you can remember that someone in the kitchens thinks you're the most important person in this whole pack. Will you be my friend?" It was such a simple request, so innocent and so impossible. Looking at his hopeful face, she hadn't been able to say no. "Yes," she'd whispered. "I'll be your friend." "Secret friends," Caspian had said solemnly. "Because new Mama doesn't like me to have friends. She says friends make you weak." Nora had felt that dangerous anger flare again. "Secret friends," she'd agreed. Over the next 4 days, Caspian sought her out. When she was crossing through the gardens with laundry, he'd appear and walk beside her, chattering about his day. When she was in the hallways, he'd peek around corners and wave at her. When she was serving in the dining hall, he'd smile at her, just at her, like she was the only person in the room. And Damon had noticed. On the day before the ceremony, Nora had been in one of the side gardens hanging laundry when she'd heard Caspian's voice. "Nora! Nora, look what I found!" She'd turned to see him running toward her, his little legs pumping. In his hands, he'd clutched a wildflower, not even a proper flower, really. Just a weed that had been missed by the gardeners. "For you," he'd said proudly, thrusting it toward her, "because you're my friend." Nora had been about to respond when she'd noticed the figure, standing at the edge of the garden. Alpha Damon, watching them with an expression she couldn't read. She'd dropped into a boo immediately, her heart in her throat. Alpha, forgive me. I wasn't encouraging. You're the Omega from the kitchen, Damon had interrupted. His voice hadn't been angry, just curious. Nora, is it? Yes, Alpha. She'd kept her eyes down. Caspian speaks of you. Damon had walked closer. He says you're his secret friend. I apologize, Alpha. I didn't mean to overstep. I know my place. It won't happen again. There had been a long pause. Look at me. It wasn't a request. Nora had raised her eyes, expecting to see anger or disgust. Instead, she'd seen something that looked almost like sadness. My son has been struggling, Damon had said quietly. Ever since I announced my engagement to Vivian, he has nightmares, refuses to eat, cries when he thinks I can't hear him. I've been so focused on pack business that I failed to see how much he needs support. He misses his mother, Nora had said before she could stop herself. Then, horrified at her own boldness, forgive me, I shouldn't have... No, you're right. He does. Damon had looked at his son, who was now trying to add the wildflower to Nora's laundry basket. But he also needs to know he's not being replaced, that he matters. And somehow you've shown him that in a way I haven't been able to. Nora hadn't known what to say to that. Damon had crouched down to Caspian's level. Son, Nora has work to do. We can't interrupt her. But she's my friend, Papa, and friends spend time together. Yes, but friends also respect each other's responsibilities. Nora has important work in the kitchen. The whole pack needs her to do that work well. Do you understand? Caspian had nodded reluctantly. Then he'd turned to Nora. Will I see you at the ceremony tomorrow? I'll be working in the kitchen, young master. I won't be at the ceremony itself. His face had fallen so dramatically that Nora had felt physically ill. Damon had studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he'd smiled. It had been a small smile, tired and tinged with something melancholy, but real. Perhaps we can arrange for you to have a break from your duties during the ceremony, he'd said. Just for a few minutes, so Caspian can see a friendly face in the crowd. Alpha, that's not necessary. I'll speak to Marta. She'll understand. Damon had stood. Everyone deserves to witness history, don't they? Even those who work in the shadows to make that history possible. It had been the kindest thing anyone of rank had ever said to Nora. Thank you, Alpha. Damon had nodded, then led Caspian away, but the boy had looked back over his shoulder and waved at her, his smile bright enough to rival the sun. The next day had dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a Luna ceremony. The pack had been buzzing with excitement since before sunrise. Visiting dignitaries had arrived from allied packs. The ceremonial grounds had been decorated with thousands of flowers. The feast had been prepared, tables groaning under the weight of food. At noon, Marta had found Nora elbow-deep in dishwater and had pulled her aside. The Alpha requested you be allowed to watch the ceremony, the old woman had said, her expression somewhere between amused and bewildered. Go change into something clean and get yourself to the ceremonial grounds. You have 1 hour. So Nora had washed her face and hands, had changed into the only decent dress she owned, a simple gray thing that had seen better days, and had made her way to the ceremonial grounds. She'd slipped into the very back of the crowd, making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She'd been surrounded by high-ranking wolves in their finest clothes, their jewelry glittering in the sunlight, and had felt painfully out of place. But she'd promised Caspian she'd be there. The ceremony had begun with traditional pack blessings. Elders had spoken about the sacred bond between Alpha and Luna. Musicians had played ancient songs. Then Damon had appeared, and the crowd had fallen silent. He'd looked magnificent and utterly miserable. He'd worn traditional ceremonial robes in deep black and silver. But his eyes had looked haunted. Vivian had appeared next, and Nora had heard the crowd's collective intake of breath. She'd been stunning. Her ceremonial gown had been pure white, embroidered with gold thread. Her blonde hair had been arranged in an elaborate style, woven with flowers and jewels. She'd looked like a goddess descending to earth. But Nora had seen what others might have missed. The calculating gleam in Vivian's eyes as she'd surveyed the crowd. The way her smile had been too perfect, like something rehearsed. The way she'd looked at Damon not with love or affection, but with triumph. The high priestess had led them through the ancient vows. Vivian had spoken her promises with a voice like honey. Damon had responded with the required words, but his voice had been flat, mechanical. Then had come the moment everyone had been waiting for, the crowning. The Luna crown of ironwood was legendary. Forged 400 years ago, blessed by the moon goddess herself, it was said to recognize the true Luna of the pack. Damon had been holding Caspian during this part of the ceremony. The boy's presence was required, a symbol of continuity and blessing. Damon had felt Caspian tense in his arms as the high priestess had lifted the crown from its velvet cushion. "With this crown, I name you Luna of Ironwood," the priestess had intoned. "May you lead with wisdom, protect with strength, and love with your whole heart." Damon had begun to reach for the crown, but Caspian had suddenly twisted in his arms with surprising strength. "No," the child had cried. "No, Papa, not her! Not her!" The crowd had gasped. "Caspian, son, we talked about this." But Caspian hadn't been listening. He'd lunged for the crown. His small hands had grabbed it before anyone could react, and he'd ripped it from the high priestess's grasp. "Caspian!" Vivian's voice had been sharp, all pretense gone. "You little brat, give that back!" Caspian had thrown himself out of his father's arms. Damon had caught him, setting him down to avoid injury, and the boy had hurled the crown away from Vivian like it burned his hands. The platinum circlet had sailed through the air, tumbling end over end, and had skittered across the marble platform. It had rolled down the steps and had come to rest at the feet of someone standing at the very edge of the crowd. At Nora's feet, time had seemed to stop. Every eye in the courtyard had turned to look at the Omega girl in the shabby gray dress, standing frozen in horror with the Luna crown at her feet. Nora's mind had gone blank with terror. This couldn't be happening. She'd be punished for this somehow, blamed for being in the wrong place, for existing at all. She'd started to bend down to pick up the crown, to return it, to apologize, to somehow fix this disaster. But Caspian had appeared in front of her. The little boy had moved faster than anyone would have thought possible. He'd darted through the crowd, had dodged grasping hands, and had reached Nora before his father or anyone else could stop him. He'd picked up the crown with his small hands, had looked up at Nora with absolute certainty in his amber eyes, and had spoken in a clear voice that carried across the suddenly silent courtyard. "This is the real Luna. The moon goddess told me. This one loves me. This one loves Papa. This one loves everybody." And then, while hundreds of high-ranking wolves watched in disbelief, Caspian had lifted the crown above his head and had placed it on Nora's auburn hair. The crown had settled on her head like it had been made for her. And then, something impossible had happened. The crown had begun to glow. Not brightly, not dramatically, just a soft platinum light that seemed to pulse in time with Nora's heartbeat. The ancient metal had warmed against her skin, and for a moment, just one crystalline moment, Nora had felt the presence of something vast and ancient and filled with love. The moon goddess. "No," Vivian had breathed, her face going white. "No, that's impossible. She's an Omega. An Omega. She can't be—" But the words had died in her throat as the light had grown stronger, as every wolf in the courtyard had felt it. A pull, a recognition, a rightness that couldn't be denied. This was their Luna. This had always been their Luna. Damon had stood frozen on the platform, staring at Nora with an expression of complete shock. But Nora had seen something else dawn in his eyes too. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of the truth his son had seen all along. Vivian had never been right. "Remove that crown immediately," Vivian had hissed. "This is a farce, a disgusting display. The crown has chosen." The high priestess's voice had rung out, ancient and powerful. She'd moved to stand beside Nora. In 400 years, the crown has never glowed for anyone. Not once. The old legends speak of this, that when the true Luna stands before her pack, the crown will shine with the moon goddess's blessing. Legends are just stories, Vivian had snapped. She'd turned to Damon. Tell them this is ridiculous. That girl is nothing. She's nobody. She's my friend, Caspian had said, moving to stand in front of Nora protectively. His small body had been trembling, but his voice had been fierce. And she's nice, and she makes Papa smile, and the crown picked her. So there. The crowd had erupted in murmurs. Damon had slowly descended from the platform. Each step had seemed to cost him, but he'd kept moving until he stood directly in front of Nora. What's your full name? He'd asked quietly. Nora Elaine Alpha. Her voice had been barely a whisper. How long have you been part of this pack? 15 years, Alpha, since my parents died in the Eastern Border conflict. Something had flickered across Damon's face. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. I remember that battle. I lost good people that day. I'm sorry for your loss. Nora hadn't known what to say to that. No one had ever apologized to her for her parents' deaths. Damon had looked at his son, still standing protectively in front of Nora. Caspian, do you understand what you've done? I picked the right Luna, Caspian had said with absolute confidence. The one the moon goddess wanted. The one who will love us right. And how do you know that? Because I asked the moon goddess every night. I asked her to help Papa find someone who would love him, and love me, and love our pack. And then I met Nora, and I knew. I just knew, Papa. Damon had closed his eyes for a long moment. When he'd opened them again, they'd been glassy with unshed tears. You asked the moon goddess for a Luna who would love us? Yes, Papa. And you think Nora is that Luna? I know she is. Don't you feel it? Don't you feel how right it is? And Damon, surrounded by his pack and his council, and his would-be Luna and hundreds of witnesses, had looked at Nora, really looked at her for the first time. He'd seen past the shabby dress and the Omega status and the social impossibility. He'd seen her. The woman who'd comforted his crying son. The woman who'd spoken of Caspian as the most important person in the pack. The woman who'd accepted a wildflower weed like it was a precious gift. And he'd felt it. The pull, the recognition, the bone-deep certainty that his son was right. This is insane, Vivian had said, her voice rising. You can't possibly be considering this. She's an Omega, Damon. She has no education, no training, no bloodline. How could she possibly be Luna? The crown chose her, the high priestess had said firmly. The moon goddess chose her. Who are we to question divine will? Divine will, Vivian had laughed, but it had been an ugly sound. This is manipulation. That child has been manipulated by a servant girl looking to climb above her station. Watch your tone, Damon had said quietly, but there had been steel in his voice. You're speaking about a member of my pack, and about my son. I'm speaking truth. That Omega has been seducing your child to get to you. Enough. The single word had cracked like a whip. Damon had straightened to his full height. Suddenly, he'd been every inch the alpha, powerful, commanding, unmistakable in his authority. You will not speak of Nora that way. You will not accuse her of manipulation without proof. And you will not call my son a fool for seeing what apparently none of us were wise enough to see. Vivian had gone very still. You're choosing her over me, over our agreement, over the alliance our union would create. I'm choosing to honor my son's wisdom and the moon goddess's will. Yes. You'll regret this, Vivian had hissed, when your pack is led by an Omega who can't even hold a political conversation. When your allies abandon you for making a mockery of tradition. When my son is happy, Damon had interrupted, when my pack is led by someone who actually cares about them. When I finally fulfill the promise I made to my mate that I would find someone who could love us. Yes, I think I can live with those consequences. Vivian's mask had finally shattered completely. Rage and humiliation had twisted her beautiful features. You fool, This Omega will destroy everything you've built." She'd ripped off her ceremonial gown's outer layer and had thrown it at Damon's feet. Then she'd stalked through the crowd and left. Damon had turned back to Nora, who stood trembling with the crown still glowing softly on her head. "Nora Elaine," he'd said formally, "the crown has chosen you. My son has chosen you. And if you're willing, I would choose you too." "Alpha, I can't." "None of us are qualified for the roles the moon goddess gives us," Damon had said gently. "But we try anyway. We learn, we grow, and we trust that there's a reason we've been called to this path." He'd reached out slowly and had taken her hand. "I'm scared," she'd whispered. "So am I," Damon had admitted. "But for the first time in 4 years, I feel like maybe I'm being guided towards something right, instead of just trying to avoid something wrong. What if I fail? Then we'll fail together, and we'll get back up and try again. That's what family does." Family. The word had hit Nora like a physical force. "Papa?" Caspian had tugged on Damon's robe. "Is Nora going to be my new mama now?" Damon had looked at Nora. "That depends. Nora has to choose too. Being Luna isn't just about ceremonies and crowns. It's about commitment. To the pack. To me. To you. And it's her choice whether she wants that." Nora had felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She'd looked at Caspian, who was watching her with those hopeful amber eyes. She'd thought about all their secret conversations, all the times she'd comforted him. She'd looked at Damon, at the vulnerability and hope in his expression, and she'd made her choice. "Yes," she'd said. "If you'll have me. Yes. I'll try. I'll probably make mistakes. But yes." Caspian had launched himself at her, wrapping his small arms around her legs and laughing. Damon had smiled, really smiled, for the first time since the ceremony had begun, and the crown on Nora's head had pulsed with warm platinum light, as if the moon goddess herself was pleased. "Let it be known throughout all territories," the high priestess had said, raising her hands. "Ironwood has found its Luna. Nora Elaine, chosen by the crown, blessed by the moon goddess, accepted by the Alpha and his heir. From this day forward, she is our Luna." The crowd had erupted. Some in cheers, some in shocked murmurs, some in obvious disapproval. But Damon had taken Nora's hand and Caspian's hand, and had led them both up onto the platform. "This is my Luna," he'd said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "This is our Luna. And anyone who has a problem with the moon goddess's choice is welcome to take it up with her directly." There had been nervous laughter, but slowly, tentatively, pack members had begun to bow. The ceremony had continued, but completely differently than planned. Nora had spoken vows she barely remembered. Damon had held her hand through the entire thing. And when it was time for the kiss to seal the bond, Damon had leaned in and whispered, "We'll take this as slowly as you need. I'm not expecting love, just partnership, and hope that maybe someday it could be more." He'd kissed her forehead instead of her lips, gentle, respectful, kind. And Nora, for the first time in her 24 years, had felt like she might actually deserve kindness. 8 months have passed since that impossible day. 8 months of Nora learning how to be Luna, of making mistakes and learning from them, of slowly earning the respect of a pack that had initially seen her as a joke. She's not perfect. She still stumbles over protocol sometimes. She still second-guesses herself in council meetings, but she's learning. And more importantly, she's leading with her heart. She's reformed the Omega treatment programs, giving them better housing and fair wages. She's established a pack school where all children, regardless of rank, learn together. She's created support systems for grieving wolves and new mothers. Other packs watch with skepticism and curiosity. Some still whisper that Ironwood is weak for having an Omega Luna. But others see the changes. The increased loyalty, the decreased unrest, the pups growing up believing they can be anything. Damon and Nora still sleep in separate rooms, but they share breakfast every morning with Caspian. They walk the packlands together in the evenings. They laugh at Caspian's antics and debate pack policy. And slowly, carefully, they're building something that looks like a family. There's no grand romance, no passionate declarations. Just two broken people trying to honor the roles they've been given. And a child who brought them together because he believed in love when everyone else believed in logic. "Do you think we'll ever be true mates?" Nora asks Damon one night, 8 months after she became Luna. They're in his study reviewing requests from pack members, and the question slips out before she can stop it. Damon looks up, surprise flickering across his face. Then he smiles. That soft smile he seems to reserve just for her and Caspian. "I don't know," he admits. "The moon goddess gives the mate bond to who she chooses, when she chooses. I had a true mate once. I loved her with everything I had. I don't know if I'm capable of that again. That's not what I asked. I asked if you think we ever will be, not if you're capable of it." Damon sets down his papers. "Do you want us to be?" Nora considers the question carefully. "I want us to be happy," she finally says, "whatever that looks like. If the moon goddess grants us a mate bond, wonderful. If she doesn't and we build something real anyway, that's wonderful too. I just don't want to spend my life waiting for something that might never come and missing what we already have." Damon's expression softens into something achingly tender. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned from my son." "Our son," Damon corrects gently. And it's true. Caspian calls her mama without hesitation now. He comes to her with his nightmares and his triumphs. She's the one who tends his scraped knees and reads his bedtime stories. "Our son," Nora agrees, and the words feel like a vow. Damon stands and crosses to her, offering his hand. "Dance with me." "There's no music." "Then we'll make our own." It's ridiculous. They have work to do and responsibilities to fulfill, and 1,000 reasons why they shouldn't be dancing in a study with no music at nearly midnight. But Nora takes his hand anyway, and they sway together in the silence. Two people who didn't choose each other, but are choosing to try anyway. Two people who are learning that sometimes the moon goddess's plan is better than anything they could have imagined. In the doorway, unnoticed by either adult, Caspian peeks in. He's supposed to be asleep, but he'd wanted a glass of water. Now he watches his parents dance, and he smiles. "Thank you, moon goddess," he whispers, "for sending Mama Nora, for making Papa smile again." A beam of moonlight streams through the window, illuminating the dancing couple. And for just a moment they're caught in silver light that seems to bless them, that seems to say, "This is right. This is how it was meant to be." Years will pass. Caspian will grow up with a mother who chose him, and a father who learned to love again. Nora will become the Luna that Ironwood didn't know they needed, one who leads with compassion instead of just strength. Damon and Nora will never receive a mate bond from the moon goddess, but they'll fall in love anyway. Slowly, carefully, building something even stronger than a bond, because it's freely chosen every single day. They'll have 3 more children together, and Caspian will grow up believing that family is built on love and choice, not just blood and bonds. The Ironwood pack will thrive under their leadership. Other packs will watch and wonder, and slowly begin to question their own rigid hierarchies. The world won't change overnight, but seeds will be planted. Seeds of hope that even an Omega can become a Luna, that even the impossible can happen when you trust in something bigger than tradition. But all of that is yet to come. For now, on this night, 8 months after a 4-year-old changed everything, there's just a man and a woman dancing in the moonlight, and a child watching from the doorway. And the quiet certainty that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, and the ones that choose us back.